The Yoon Suk Yeol administration marks its second anniversary in office this week. And in this edition of Issues and Insiders, our foreign correspondents touch upon this occasion and more. Welcome to Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. President Yoon Suk Yeol held an unscripted press conference earlier this morning in light of the second anniversary of his inauguration, which took place on May 10th, 2022. For more on this, I have Sebastien Falletti here in the studio. Sebastien, as always, welcome.
Thank you.
I also have Thomas Maresca with us. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here.
Sebastien, let's begin then with your takeaway from the President's press conference earlier this morning.
Well, the first thing to say is the press conference did happen. It was the first press conference, is the one he did in 2022 for the 101st day in office. So it's kind of a turnaround for President Yoon Suk Yeol, who after the election in April, which was a crushing defeat for his party, is trying to reset his presidency, is trying to rekindle ties with the Korean people, is trying to move to a new stage. So clearly this press conference itself wasn't even in the sense that he's trying to reach out to the people and the people of Korea, but also the National Assembly, because he needs the National Assembly to, if he wants to do something from the rest of his mandate. President, I think he's been trying to give an image of being a bit more balanced. The first Yoon Suk Yeol was very direct, very sometimes abrasive. This time he's trying to reach out more to the people, to try to find a common ground. That's the attempt in terms of style. Of course, the main takeaway is what he said about he's trying to protect himself from the political guerrilla we're going to see at the National Assembly. And the first front he's facing is, of course, about his wife, about the First Lady. There's a lot of accusation. The opposition is trying to push that button. So he made some apology about, he said, unwise conduct of the First Lady, which is the first time that he makes such a statement. But at the same time, he's been opposing any special counsel probe on a separate investigation on potential alleged stock price fixing. So clearly here the strategy is like to try to gain some support from the people, but at the same time try to draw a line with the opposition to make sure he has to be very defensive and protect his ground. So it's the beginning of the second part of his mandate, and it's going to be 3 years, it's going to be challenging. And probably today was the first act of this second stage.
Right. It was a press conference, the first in some 21 months, I believe. Thomas, what were some of your takeaways?
Right. Well, Sebastien definitely covered a lot of it. I think just the fact that, holding this press conference was kind of a news and a noteworthy event in itself, and, clearly demonstrates that he knows he has to try and make a new push towards, communicating more with the public and with his, political opponents. So a kind of a more perhaps chastened tone. Although, I still feel like it's not his natural kind of bearing. I think it doesn't always, I think it's not his natural position to be very political or very ingratiating. So I think it will be a challenge for him moving forward. Just some of the stuff maybe he touched on, I noticed, in the first part of his prepared remarks, he was kind of highlighting some of the accomplishments of his administration. Really was a heavy emphasis on, the diplomatic front and his, growing closer with the U.S. and Japan, strengthening those alliances and, the trilateral cooperation. So I think that's really the most, that he can point to as sort of the successes of this administration. So he kind of highlighted those at the top. Addressing maybe the low birth rate issue is another thing that stood out, and this idea of actually forming a ministry to address that is, maybe another key line from this speech. But otherwise, as Sebastien mentioned as well, he addressed the scandal or the corruption potential probe around his wife with this Dior bag thing. So he had to bring that up. I mean, I think, and we'll see what what happens going forward.
Right, we will see. Sebastien, the Yoon Suk Yeol administration has been in office for the past 2 years now. That being said, from a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest score, what would you give the administration with regard to its efforts to deal with North Korea?
Right, that's always very challenging to play with numbers, but I think I would say, like, of course, if you look at the way you strengthen deterrence, you get closer to the US, to Japan, you could give a very high mark. You could say it's going to 8 to 10, but if you're looking at engagement, we are close to 0. So maybe in total we are more, I would say, around 5, because the big question is here, I mean, President Yoon Suk Yeol is clearly departing from his previous conservative predecessor, because he's clearly strengthening the alliance with the US, and he's showing a very firm line, but he hasn't shown any appetite for dialogue with North Korea, even though he said in the press conference that he's open, but it sounds very rhetorical. And if you look even like President Park Geun-hye or President Lee Myung-bak, even though they were advocating a very firm line on North Korea, there was still some back channel. There was some, we know Park Geun-hye had been to Pyongyang. There was some way of communicating and using both carrot and sticks. The current administration is much more on the carrot side. And of course, there's also a different situation in North Korea with Kim Jong-un, who's also building up his military and turning his back on diplomacy. So it's a very tense environment. And for the moment, both sides are extremely firm. The question for the future is, like, what happens if there is a crisis, if there is a miscalculation? When you are in such a firm position, there's very little room of maneuver in case of crisis for the administration to find a common ground. So I would say that's the big question, is like, in case of crisis, what happened? And second, is there any chance at some point to talking again with North Korea? Is there any plan B? Does they have any channel to talk to Pyongyang if needed?
So with regard to efforts to engage North Korea, Sebastien will give the administration a 5. But with regard to engaging with the broader diplomatic community, he's going to give the administration a score between 8 and 10. What about you, Thomas?
Right. Well, looking at maybe focusing more on the outside of North Korea side of it, on this sort of, global pivotal state vision that Yoon laid out, I would say probably that's the most successful part of his administration so far. And, a number, maybe it's hard to say, like something like a 7, but, just because there's also a lot that is still unresolved, it's still in the works. But I mean, just on a kind of a fundamental level, I think this administration has definitely kind of elevated the perception of South Korea as a global player, and has, certainly with the strengthening relations with the U.S., trying to mend fences somewhat with Japan and getting closer in that sort of trilateral way with those allies, and just in a more general sense, kind of proposing this sort of aspirational vision of what South Korea, stands for in the world, and having a kind of a value-driven approach to diplomacy, focusing on, freedom, human rights, rule of law, that sort of. I mean, that's a very clear vision that's been laid out, and I think, the willingness to go out and spread that message and to really engage. Not just with traditionally with like Washington, but I think Yoon has really been all over the world, sort of selling this message, and has strengthened some at least presence in places like the EU, or in areas that Korea has not. I mean, it's not completely out of the blue, but certain regions that are not so strictly ideologically tied to one side or the other, like in the Middle East, or the South Korea has engaged with the UAE and the Gulf states, and has a free trade agreement with them, or moving into some of the developing world areas. I mean, South Korea, this administration has raised the ODA contribution this year, the overseas development aid, by something like 43%, which is a big step forward for South Korea to sort of present itself as ready and willing to contribute to the global good in a way that is a bolder way than in the past. And there's a story that South Korea can definitely tell about being a country that came from receiving development to one that is giving development. I mean, there's a Korea-Africa summit coming up here. So I'm seeing, you can see South Korea emerging in those places. And, certainly I would say the profile has risen significantly. I mean, there's still, some of it is just, how much of it is showing up at summits and just sort of image, and how much of it is substantial. And, I think critics might say, are you trying to overreach? How there are limits to how far South Korea can go. You might point to something like wanting to host the Busan Expo as a case of overreach. And, I think South Korea still is hedging a bit, has to hedge a bit in terms of relationship to China. Even some of the Russia-Ukraine question is still up. So, overall, there's a lot that needs to be sort of played out. And obviously, geopolitically, what happens in the world will help determine some of that. But I would say, as far as a clear vision and a policy and, actions that have pursued that, this has been, I would say, probably the most successful side of the administration.
Right. And very frequently during his diplomatic missions overseas, Sebastien, President Yoon Suk Yeol has referred to himself as the country's #1 salesperson. That being said, what do you believe are some of his notable economic gains over the past 2 years?
Well, I mean, the things like, as in his address today, President Yoon Suk Yeol is trying to show that he's trying to improve the livelihood of Koreans. He's been saying that he has been rolling out a pro-business agenda that he had advocated during his campaign, and he's been pushing for that and trying to roll back some of the decisions made by the previous administration. If we look coldly what happened, actually he couldn't achieve much because of the lack of majority at the National Assembly. So I mean, there is a lot of things he said, but like if you look at, for example, let's say the working hours plan, he had this ambitious plan last year to raise the working hours maximum in Korea to 69 hours, and this plan had to be rolled back because of opposition. So this is the big problem of this president. This is the first president in Korean young democracy that's not going to have any majority during his 5th term. So the big problem is how domestically you push your agenda if you cannot get those bills through. And of course, since the April election, this dilemma is becoming even more intense. So I would say that he's definitely pushing in a very forceful way. And we've seen also on the doctors front, he's been trying to raise dramatically the number of doctor admission. And this struggle is still ongoing. So we can see there is a strong will, but there's also strong resistance. And this is the big question mark for the next 3 years for him domestically. What can he achieve? And to do that, he's going to need to find some compromise with the opposition, which is a political game, which is a tactical game, which is a complicated game for a president that cannot run again.
Right. As Sebastien mentioned, the prolonged medical walkout, Thomas, remains a domestic agenda that needs to be tackled by the Yoon administration. That being said, what other agendas on the domestic front remain to be addressed by the Yoon Suk Yeol administration?
Right. Well, really, all of the issues that led, I think, to such a kind of resounding defeat in the midterm elections are still hanging over this administration. And from just economic challenges, sustaining or kind of boosting economic growth is going to be a question. Just prices. I mean, food prices was a massive, sort of touch point in the run-up to the election. Sort of the questions, which some of those are not necessarily only, unique to South Korea, but the housing cost has been just an issue that has bedeviled this administration, the previous administration, and so questions of how to get that market sort of under control is very much up in the air. The medical strike, as you talked about, and doing all of this within this just deeply polarized political climate is a challenge. I mean, most of the major reforms on the domestic front have really not made much headway in any of them. I mean, it was labor reform, education reform, pension reform, and it's been just a big challenge with already the opposition in power. And I think also, you could say that there hasn't been a tremendous amount of clarity as to some of those agendas, something like the labor reform, like you mentioned, the sort of raising the working hours, then kind of having to pull that back. I think with education, it was something, changing the collegiate exam, but then that sort of didn't quite pan out the way that it was planned. So I think there's been a lack of clarity in just what he's really trying to sell. I mean, clearly, I think generally speaking, yes, it's been more of a private enterprise, free market approach to stimulating the economy, but that's going to be really difficult on a lot of fronts to get domestic policies across. So can he work with the opposition, or what areas can they agree on? I mean, even the medical reform, I think, had kind of more widespread public support than some of the other issues, but it's kind of has not worked out in his favor. So yeah, there really are a lot of challenges. I mean, they're not only unique to Korea necessarily, but certainly the birth rate too, and the sort of demographic challenges ahead, as he mentioned in the address today, I mean, are also just a really, really kind of red light blinking, for the future.
Right, and speaking about challenges, Sebastien, some claim also on the diplomatic front, the Yoon Suk Yeol is looking ahead at a few challenges, especially with regard to better engaging its regional partners such as China. We have a trilateral summit coming up later this month. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as Thomas said, there was a lot of, this administration has advocated a very clear line and much more aligned with the US and with Japan. And the Washington Declaration, for example, was definitely a success to get for a current president. But now I think the coming years, the big challenge is how you deal with the consequence of this alignment. We know that South Korea always tried to balance its relationship between the US and China. And of course, this clear shift toward Washington is endangering the ties with China, also economic ties, diplomatic ties, and still China and Korea have a huge economic relationship. Korea cannot afford to ignore China. So the big challenge ahead is to balance this in a much more tense geopolitical environment. I think that's a key challenge. And the relation with China, there will be this summit, but we still don't know if President Xi Jinping will ever visit Seoul, even though we hear about it, but it's been constantly postponed, which shows the friction. And beyond the region, also the challenge, the US is gonna ask South Korea to engage more on sensitive issues like the Taiwan issue, democracy. All these things are much more sensitive. That's kind of out of the comfort zone for South Korea. South Korea has always tried to avoid those hot spots, but increasingly by aligning with Washington, they're going to be pushed to take a stance on that. And then finally, I would say, also beyond Asia, Europe, Ukraine, we know that South Korea has been developing ties with Eastern Europe, with Poland, weapons deal. But we know also the North Korean issue is connected now to Ukraine through the ammunitions sent by North Korea. So the two Koreas are drawn into the Ukraine-European security quagmire, and that, of course, offer opportunities, including in terms of defense sale, but also risks of backfire. We know that Russia is not happy about it. Russia is increasing the pressure on South Korea. So I think that's also one of the challenges ahead, is like, how are you going to have to deal with the consequence of your choices you made, the bold choice that were signaled by Thomas. Now, the next coming years, Korea is going to face some of the consequences, which are not always pleasant or easy to deal with.
You're right. Well, that is what the administration will have to deal with over the next 3 years then. All right, Sebastien, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
And Thomas, thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks.
Right, well, that ends Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow, that is Friday.